poor girl gives her jacket to warm a millionaire disguised as a homeless man, and the next day finds a fortune at her door. Emily Harper was a 17-year-old girl with expressive eyes that reflected a blend of strength and vulnerability. Growing up in Detroit, she was all too familiar with the challenges of a life defined by the daily struggle to survive. Her home was a worn-down apartment in a modest neighborhood, where she lived with her mother, Margaret, and her 8-year-old brother, Tommy. Emily's mother was debilitated by a chronic illness, and the cost of medication often exceeded the family's financial means. Emily carried a weight of responsibility far beyond what her age suggested. To keep the household afloat, she worked part-time as a waitress at a local diner while attending high school. Her dream of going to college seemed distant, almost unattainable, yet she refused to let go of hope. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. That year's winter seemed harsher than any Detroit had endured before. The apartment windows were perpetually frosted over, and the biting wind found its way through cracks in the walls, ensuring the home was never truly warm. The only piece of clothing that provided her any real protection was an old gray wool coat she had inherited from her father before his passing. Though worn and patched, it remained her most loyal companion during the frigid months. Despite the difficulties, Emily stayed optimistic and determined. Every day, she reminded herself that better days lay ahead, even if the world around her suggested otherwise. Her love for her family was her greatest strength, and she would do anything to ensure Tommy had a brighter future and that her mother didn't suffer unnecessarily. Detroit's winter was relentless. The streets were blanketed with a thick layer of snow that piled higher with each passing day. The icy wind blew mercilessly, cutting through anyone daring enough to venture out without adequate protection. As she did every day, Emily braved the cold to get to and from the diner where she worked. Though resilient, her old coat couldn't always keep out the bitter chill, but she refused to complain. There were others in far worse situations, she told herself, trying to convince herself that her reality wasn't so bad. The small apartment she shared with her mother and brother felt colder with each passing night. The heating had been broken for weeks, and the makeshift efforts to warm the space with blankets and small electric heaters were woefully inadequate. Margaret, Emily's mother, coughed more and more, her labored breathing becoming a constant sound in the background. Emily did everything in her power to make their home comfortable, but the battle against the cold seemed unwinnable. Tommy, her younger brother, was the one who suffered the most from the harsh winter. Despite his age, he tried to be as strong as Emily. Yet, there were moments when he couldn't hold back his tears as the icy wind seeped through the poorly sealed windows. In those moments, Emily would hold him tightly, promising him that one day, everything would get better. One night, after a long shift at the diner, Emily walked through the snow-covered streets, feeling her toes nearly frozen inside her worn-out boots. As she passed a corner known for being a frequent gathering spot for the homeless, she noticed hunched figures under tattered blankets, desperately trying to shield themselves from the biting wind. Her heart tightened. Winter, though harsh for everyone, was an even harsher sentence of suffering for those without a roof over their heads. As she thought about this, she pulled her old coat tighter around her body and quickened her pace toward home, trying to push away the feeling of helplessness. That same night, as Emily continued her walk through the icy streets toward the small apartment, something caught her attention. A man was sitting on the sidewalk, hunched under a thin, dirty blanket. He was visibly trembling, his wrinkled hands cupped around his mouth, trying to warm himself with his breath, which formed small puffs of vapor in the freezing air. Beside him, a small empty plastic cup suggested he was hoping for some help, but the street was nearly deserted, and the few passers-by hurried along, avoiding his presence as if he didn't exist. Emily slowed her pace. There was something about the man that made her stop. Maybe it was the way he kept his head lowered, as if he wished to disappear, or maybe it was his hands, so pale they looked as though they might freeze at any moment. For a brief instant, she hesitated. She knew she didn't have much to offer, but the cold she felt in her own bones made her imagine what he must be enduring. "Are you okay?" she asked, her soft voice almost lost in the wind. The man slowly raised his eyes. His face was aged, deeply lined with years of hardship. Yet his eyes held something different. There was sadness, but also something else, an unexpected glimmer of curiosity. I'm just trying to stay warm," he replied, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. A wave of empathy washed over Emily. Without thinking twice, she began to take off her coat. The freezing wind immediately stung her body, but she ignored the discomfort. "You need this more than I do. Please take it." The man looked surprised, almost shocked by her gesture. "I can't accept that. You'll freeze without it," he said, raising his hands in a gesture of refusal. "I'll manage. My house isn't warm, but at least I have a roof over my head." "You're out here," Emily insisted, holding the coat out toward him. Hesitantly, the man took the coat. His eyes glistened for a brief moment, perhaps with gratitude, perhaps with emotion. "Thank you," he said simply, as though no words could fully express what he felt. Emily gave him a faint smile before continuing on her way. The cold now seemed even more brutal, but inside her heart, there was a small flame of warmth. The simple act of giving away her coat was, to her, a way of doing something good, even in a world that felt so harsh and indifferent. After giving away her coat, Emily continued walking through the snow-covered streets, keeping her arms crossed in an attempt to preserve some warmth. The icy wind bit at her face, and she could feel the cold seeping into her very bones. Yet, despite the discomfort, there was an unusual calm in her heart. The act of helping someone in need had warmed her soul, even as her body suffered. When she arrived home, she found Tommy already asleep on the small couch in the living room, wrapped in a tattered blanket. Margaret was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a tired expression as she sorted through the few remaining medications. When she saw Emily come in without her coat, her brow furrowed immediately. "Emily, where's your jacket?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with concern. "I gave it to someone who needed it more than I did," Emily replied, rubbing her hands together in an effort to warm them. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "You can't afford to do that, Emily. We barely have enough as it is." "I know, Mom, but he was out there, shivering, with nothing to protect him. I couldn't just walk by and pretend I didn't see him," Emily said, her voice firm but laden with emotion. Margaret sighed deeply, looking at her daughter with a mixture of pride and worry. "You have a big heart, Emily, but sometimes having a big heart can hurt." "I don't regret it, Mom," Emily said as she picked up a cup of hot tea Margaret had made. "He needed that coat, and we'll be okay." The night passed slowly, with Emily and Margaret doing their best to stay warm. Emily fell asleep with a faint smile on her face, believing that, even in her modest life, she had made a small difference in the world. However, in the early hours of the morning, Emily began to feel the weight of the cold pressing on her body. The absence of her coat was more noticeable as the wind seeped through the cracks in the windows. Still, she held firm to her decision, thinking of the man who now had a bit more comfort in the brutal winter. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the apartment's window, though the relentless cold lingered. Emily woke up with her muscles stiff from a restless night and the freezing temperatures. Nevertheless, she pulled herself out of the makeshift bed on the floor, determined to face another day. Tommy was already at the table, eating a thin slice of bread she had saved for him the night before. As Emily tried to warm some water to make tea, a noise came from the front door. It sounded like something being left outside, followed by quick footsteps retreating down the hall. Margaret looked up, surprised. "Are you expecting anyone, Emily?" she asked. Emily furrowed her brow and walked to the door. When she opened it, her eyes widened in shock. Sitting right at the entrance was a brown leather suitcase, seemingly brand new. At first, she thought it might have been left there by mistake. She looked around, but the street was deserted. The only sound was the wind howling through the alleys. "Who left this here?" Margaret asked, stepping closer. Emily hesitated before crouching down and unzipping the suitcase. As the zipper slid smoothly, she froze. Inside was an overwhelming amount of money. Neatly stacked bills filled the suitcase, with a white envelope resting on top. "What is this?" Margaret asked, disbelief evident in her voice. While Tommy watched from a distance, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. Emily carefully picked up the envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The message, written in elegant handwriting, read, "Dear Emily, I know this may seem strange, but the kindness you showed last night was something I haven't witnessed in a very long time. In a world so cold and selfish, you chose to give the little you had to help someone who appeared to have nothing. Consider this a gift. Use it to transform your life and your families. You deserve it. With gratitude, a grateful old man." Emily read and reread the letter, her heart racing. Margaret stood by, speechless. Is this real?" "I don't know," Emily replied, still trying to process what had just happened. "But I think it is." Tommy ran over to peek into the suitcase, his eyes shining with excitement. "Emily, this could change everything." Emily felt a mix of relief and confusion. Who was that man? Was he really just a homeless person? Or was there something more behind his humble appearance? As these questions swirled in her mind, one thing became clear. Her life would never be the same. The small apartment's living room was filled with a tense, uneasy silence. Margaret stood frozen beside the table, clutching the note with trembling hands, while Tommy couldn't contain his excitement, pointing at the money as if he'd uncovered buried treasure. Emily, however, felt torn. On one hand, the sight of the suitcase full of money was an immediate solution to their problems. On the other hand, the mysterious note and the way everything had unfolded felt surreal, almost like something out of a dream or a fairy tale. "This can't be real," Margaret murmured, finally breaking the silence. "Who just leaves that much money at someone's door? There must be some mistake." "But the letter is clear," Emily replied, trying to contain the wave of emotions surging inside her. "He knew what I did. It must be the man I met last night." Margaret cast a worried glance at her daughter. "Emily, what if this is some kind of trap? Money like this, it doesn't just appear. People don't do things like this." Tommy, still caught up in his excitement, exclaimed, "What if he's like a secret Santa? Like, he saw you being kind and decided to reward you?" Despite Tommy's childlike naivety, the idea lingered in Emily's mind. Maybe that man was far more than he seemed. Perhaps he had tested her kindness, disguised as he was, to see how she would react. "Whatever it is, we need to decide what to do," Emily said, pulling the suitcase inside and carefully closing the door, as if someone outside might glimpse its contents. "Return it, of course," Margaret replied, her voice slightly louder than usual. "This isn't ours. We don't know where it came from." Emily lowered her head for a moment. A part of her agreed with her mother, but another part, the part that had seen the overdue rent, the dwindling medications, and Tommy's worn-out boots, knew this money could save her family. "What if it really is a gift?" Emily asked, lifting her eyes. "He wrote in the letter that I should use it to change our lives. And God knows how much we need it." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Her eyes betrayed the internal battle between the principles she had always instilled in her children and the harsh reality they faced every day. Finally, she sighed. "If we decide to keep it, Emily, you have to be careful. We don't know who this person is. We don't know what they might want." Emily nodded slowly. "I will, Mom. Promise." As they tucked the suitcase into a safe corner of the apartment, a flicker of hope began to grow in Emily's heart. For the first time in years, it felt like something good was happening. Yet, even amidst the joy, she couldn't shake the feeling that this gift carried with it a mystery still waiting to be unraveled. In the days that followed, the suitcase's presence in the apartment brought a mix of tension and anticipation. Margaret insisted that Emily keep the money out of sight, fearing that anyone who found out might assume the family had done something wrong to obtain it. Emily, however, couldn't stop thinking about the letter and the man she had helped that night. Every detail of the encounter replayed in her mind over and over, yet she still couldn't fit all the pieces together. At the same time, she felt the weight of the decisions she needed to make. The suitcase held enough money to pay off all their debts, buy her mother's medications, get new clothes for Tommy, and perhaps, just maybe, bring some comfort to the family. Yet, the money seemed to raise more questions than answers. One morning, while Margaret rested in the bedroom and Tommy played with an old toy car in the living room, Emily decided to take action. She picked up the letter again and read it carefully, searching for any clues. A grateful old man, it was signed. But who was he, really? Why was he on the street? And, most importantly, why had he chosen her to receive such a grand gift? Driven by these questions, Emily returned to the corner where she had first encountered the man. It was a cold morning, and snow had started falling again. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few cars passing by and hurried pedestrians trying to escape the chill. When she arrived at the spot, she saw it was empty. There was no blanket, no cup, no sign of him. Disappointed, Emily began to walk away when an elderly woman, who appeared to be homeless, called to her from a nearby corner. "Are you looking for someone?" asked the woman, bundled in layers of worn clothing. Emily stopped, surprised. "Yes, an older man. He was here a few days ago. Do you know who he is?" The woman tilted her head as if in thought. "Oh, the man in the torn suit? He stayed here for a few nights, but then he disappeared. No one knows where he went. Polite man, you know? Different from most." "He was wearing a suit?" Emily asked, intrigued. "Yes, an old suit, like he came from somewhere important before ending up on the street. But he didn't seem like the others. He looked temporary, like he didn't belong there." Those words echoed in Emily's mind as she walked back home. A torn suit? It only reinforced her suspicion that the man was no ordinary homeless person. She still didn't have concrete answers, but for the first time, she felt there was something much bigger behind their encounter. When she returned, she found Margaret at the table, her expression a mix of concern and anticipation. "You went looking for him, didn't you?" her mother asked. Emily nodded. "Yes, but he wasn't there. A woman told me he seemed different, like he didn't belong to that life." Margaret took a deep breath. "Emily, maybe he just wanted to disappear after helping you. Some people prefer to remain anonymous." "Maybe," Emily replied, but deep down, she knew this story wasn't over. The following days were marked by a growing sense of restlessness. Emily couldn't stop wondering about the mysterious man and the reason behind his generosity. Margaret, though still concerned, began to accept that the money was there, ready to be used. Tommy, on the other hand, couldn't contain his excitement, imagining all the possibilities that gift could bring. On an especially cold afternoon, Emily decided it was time to take practical action. Using a portion of the money from the suitcase, she went to the nearest pharmacy and bought the medication her mother desperately needed, along with some more substantial food for dinner. Though she had avoided spending any of it until that point, seeing her mother rest more comfortably that night made her realize that perhaps this gift was, indeed, a blessing. Yet the sense of mystery lingered. One evening, as Emily returned home from work, she encountered something unexpected. A distinguished man in a discreet black car parked in front of her building. He wore an immaculate suit and seemed entirely out of place in the modest neighborhood. "Emily Harper?" he called out as soon as he saw her. She froze for a moment, her heart racing. "Yes, that's me. Who are you?" The man offered a slight smile, as if to reassure her. "My name is Michael. I work for Mr. Thomas Bennett." Emily blinked, confused. Thomas Bennett? I don't know anyone by that name. Actually, you do, Michael replied. Mr. Bennett is the man you helped a few days ago, on that cold night. Emily took a step back, trying to process the information. Wait, are you saying he wasn't homeless? Michael shook his head. Not exactly. Mr. Bennett is a well-known philanthropist, but he prefers to experience the realities of those in need firsthand. He disguises himself to observe the world without the privileges that usually surround him. He sent me here because he'd like to speak with you personally. Emily felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The revelation seemed unbelievable, yet at the same time it made perfect sense. The torn suit, the polite demeanor, the letter. It all pointed to something far greater than she had imagined. Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would he do this? Because you impressed him, Emily, Michael replied, his tone serious. Very few people, even those who have a lot, show the generosity you did, especially when they have so little themselves. He saw something special in you and wants to thank you properly. Are you willing to meet him? Emily hesitated for a moment, but she knew she needed answers. Yes, I'm willing. Michael nodded and opened the car door for her. As Emily got in, she felt a mix of nervousness and curiosity. The mystery surrounding her was starting to unravel, but she had a feeling that this meeting would bring more revelations than she could imagine. Emily gazed out of the car window as Michael drove through the streets of Detroit. The familiar sights of her modest neighborhood quickly gave way to wide avenues lined with elegant buildings and gleaming storefronts. The stark contrast made her feel uneasy, yet intrigued. Who was Thomas Bennett, really? And why had he chosen her? The car pulled up in front of an imposing building with a gleaming glass facade that reflected the gray winter sky. Michael quickly got out and opened the door for Emily, who hesitated before stepping out. The grandeur of the place felt overwhelming. This way, Michael said, guiding her inside the building. The interior was even more breathtaking, with a marble-clad lobby and chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Emily felt out of place but held her head high. She didn't know what to expect, but she was determined to get answers. They ascended in an elevator that seemed to climb endlessly, until the doors opened to a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. There he was, Thomas Bennett. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, but his face was unmistakable. It was the same man Emily had helped that night, though now he was clean-shaven, polished, and exuded an air of authority. Emily, he said warmly, a smile spreading across his face. It's a pleasure to finally meet you under different circumstances. Emily stepped forward, still a bit nervous. I don't know what to say. I didn't expect any of this. Please have a seat, he said, gesturing to a nearby chair. I'm sure you have many questions. She sat down slowly, still trying to process everything. You really were on the street that night? Why? Thomas sighed, folding his hands on the table. Yes, I was. It's something I do regularly. I've spent most of my life in environments like this, surrounded by comfort and wealth. But over time, I realized it distanced me from the realities most people face. So, I choose to step away from this life every now and then, to see the world as it truly is. And why help me like this? Emily asked, her voice laced with curiosity. I only did what anyone would have done. Ah, but that's not true, Thomas replied, his eyes locking onto hers. Very few people, especially in your circumstances, would have done what you did. You sacrificed something important to help someone you barely knew. That moved me deeply. Emily felt warmth rise to her cheeks. She wasn't used to receiving compliments. I just did what I thought was right. And that is precisely why I'm here now, Thomas said with a smile. I want to offer you more than just money. I want to give you an opportunity to change your life and your family's life. But first, I want to hear your story. I want to understand who you are. Emily, the sincerity in his words disarmed Emily. For the first time, she felt as though someone was genuinely interested in her, not just in her struggles, but in her essence. As she began to share her life, her challenges, and her dreams, she realized that this meeting might be far more than a coincidence. As Emily spoke, Thomas listened attentively, never interrupting. She told him about her life in Detroit, the small apartment she shared with her mother and brother, the cold nights without heat, and the struggles of balancing school and work to help support her family. Her voice, though steady, carried a weight that Thomas seemed to understand deeply. "I grew up believing that if I just kept working hard, things would get better," Emily said, her gaze distant. "But sometimes it feels like no matter how much I try, the problems only pile up." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "And yet, you've never lost your compassion. That is rare, Emily, and precious." She lowered her eyes, feeling both vulnerable and seen in a way she had never experienced before. "I didn't do anything special that night. I just couldn't ignore what was right in front of me." Thomas smiled gently, folding his hands on the table. "True kindness is always special, and that's what brought me to you. I want to offer you something that goes beyond money. I want to give you the tools to create the life you dream of." "Tools?" Emily asked, looking up. "Yes, I want to help you study, find your true passion, and channel your energy into that path. You have incredible potential, and I want to make sure it isn't wasted because of your circumstances." Emily remained silent, absorbing his words. It was such a grand offer that it felt almost unreal. She thought about her mother, who needed constant care, about Tommy, who dreamed of a different life, and about herself, who, for the first time, began to believe that maybe she could dream too. "But why?" she finally asked. "Why me? You could help anyone." Thomas took a deep breath before answering. "Because I was once like you, Emily. Before I built all of this, I knew what it felt like to struggle every day just to survive. Someone believed in me when I needed it most. Now, I'm here to do the same for you." His words resonated deeply with Emily. For the first time, she felt that this opportunity wasn't a trap or some inexplicable stroke of luck. It was the result of something she carried within herself, something others were finally recognizing. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice heavy with emotion. "You don't have to say anything right now," Thomas replied with a warm smile. "Just think about it, and know that whatever you decide, you've already made a difference. For me, and for many others you don't even realize." As Emily returned home that night, watching the city of Detroit pass by through the car window, she felt different. For the first time in a long time, there was a light on her path, and she was ready to follow it. Emily spent the night reflecting on Thomas's proposal. His words echoed in her mind, stirring a mix of hope and uncertainty. For the first time, the possibility of a different life felt within reach. But along with it came doubts. What if she failed? What if she wasn't good enough to seize the opportunity? The next morning, Emily was in the kitchen making tea when Margaret entered, still looking tired but more alert. "You seemed distracted last night," her mother said as she pulled out a chair and sat at the table. "I met Thomas Bennett," Emily replied after a long sigh. She recounted every detail of the meeting, from the moment she got into the car to the proposal he had made. Margaret listened silently, her eyes fixed on her daughter. "He wants to help you," Margaret finally said. "But do you want this?" Emily hesitated. "I want to change our lives, Mom. I want you to get the care you need, and I want Tommy to have a future. But it's scary. It all feels so big, so out of my reach." Margaret leaned forward and took Emily's hands in hers. "You've been through so much. If he believes in you, then maybe it's time for you to believe in yourself too." Those words stayed with Emily as she left the house for a brief walk around the neighborhood. She observed the same streets she had always known, but this time, she saw them differently. The harsh winter cold felt a little less cruel, and the people around her, even hurried or distant, seemed a bit closer. It was as if the world was offering her a chance, and she was finally beginning to believe she could take it. That afternoon, Emily met Michael again as planned. He drove her back to Thomas's building, where she was greeted with a warmer, more familiar reception this time. Thomas was waiting for her, wearing the same kind expression but now with a more serious air about him. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" he asked, gesturing for her to sit. "Yes," Emily replied, with more confidence than she expected. "I want to accept your help, but not just for me. I want to do something that helps my mom, my brother, and, if I can, others like me." Thomas smiled, clearly pleased with her response. "That's exactly the mindset I hoped for. We'll start with what's most urgent for you. After that, we'll work together to build a plan for the future." Emily felt a wave of relief and determination at the same time. For the first time, she felt like she had control over her life. She knew the road wouldn't be easy, but with Thomas's support, she believed she could face anything. As the meeting concluded, Thomas handed her a folder containing details about a scholarship program he wanted her to consider, as well as information about support services that could assist her mother. Emily left the building with the certainty that, finally, something good was beginning, not just for her but for everyone around her. With her decision made, Emily's life began to change in tangible ways. The very next day, Michael returned to the apartment with a series of instructions and documents outlining the initial support Thomas had prepared. Among them were arrangements for the immediate payment of Margaret's medical bills and the settlement of their overdue rent, lifting a weight that had seemed unbearable for the family. Emily felt immense gratitude as she watched her mother receive the medication she so desperately needed. Margaret, still cautious, looked at her daughter while holding the pills in her hands. "It feels strange to have one less worry after so long, but maybe this really is the start of something good." In addition, Thomas ensured that Tommy could enroll in a quality private school, where he would receive special attention to nurture his talents. When the boy heard the news, he ran to hug Emily with excitement. "Is this real? Am I really going to a new school?" he asked, his eyes shining with happiness. "Yes, Tommy," Emily replied, her smile warm. "You deserve this." As she took care of her family's most pressing needs, Emily also began to plan for her own future. The scholarship Thomas had introduced her to was for a program in administration and social projects. The idea of studying something that could positively impact other lives excited her but also scared her. She had never thought of herself as someone who could lead major initiatives, but now she was starting to believe it might actually be possible. One afternoon, during another meeting at Thomas's building, he introduced Emily to a woman named Claire, the director of a charitable foundation he managed. Claire, an elegant and confident woman, shook Emily's hand firmly and said, "Thomas has told me a lot about you. I believe you have incredible potential, and I want to help you develop it." Emily was surprised but grateful for the warm welcome. During their conversation, Claire explained that she wanted Emily to attend some of the foundation's meetings to learn how their projects operated and, eventually, to find an area where she could contribute directly. "You have a unique perspective, Emily," Claire said. "People like you who have experienced hardship firsthand understand better than anyone where the real needs are. That's the kind of insight we want here." Those words resonated deeply with Emily. For the first time, she felt that her story wasn't just a burden but something that could be used to make a difference. As she headed home that evening, Emily thought about everything that was happening. The rapid pace of change was almost overwhelming, but at the same time, she felt that every step was taking her closer to a place she had always wanted to be, a place where she could not only help her family but also give back to the world what she was now receiving. Emily's days became a mix of challenges and discoveries. While her mother began recovering with the new treatments and Tommy adapted to his new school, Emily immersed herself in the meetings at Thomas Bennett's charitable foundation. At first, she felt out of place in an environment where everyone seemed so experienced and confident. But Claire, ever attentive, made a point of including her in every discussion and ensuring her voice was heard. In one of those meetings, as they discussed a project to build a shelter for the homeless, Emily finally gathered the courage to speak up. "I think, in addition to a shelter, you could invest in something more lasting, like skills training programs or workshops to help these people find jobs and rebuild their lives." The room fell silent for a moment. All eyes turned to Emily, and she felt her cheeks flush. Then Claire smiled. "That's exactly what we need," she said. "An approach that doesn't just address the immediate problem, but creates opportunities for transformation." Thomas, who was present, nodded approvingly. "Emily, this is exactly what we talked about earlier. Your perspective is valuable because it comes from experience. Keep sharing your ideas." After that meeting, Emily began to feel more confident. She became more actively involved in the projects and even started proposing new initiatives. One of her first efforts was organizing a campaign to collect coats and blankets for the winter, something she understood deeply from her own experience. She led the project with dedication, spending her evenings sorting through donations and her mornings visiting shelters to distribute them. During one of these visits, she met a young woman named Lily, who seemed to be around her age. Lily was sitting in a corner of the shelter, wrapped in a thin blanket, her eyes cast downward. Emily approached slowly and sat beside her. "Hi, I'm Emily," she said with a warm smile. Lily looked up hesitantly. "Hi, I'm Lily. It's okay if you don't want to talk right now," Emily said. "But if you ever do, I'm here." In the days that followed, Emily returned to the shelter and got to know Lily's story. She learned that Lily had run away from home to escape an abusive environment and was now trying to survive on her own. This connection deeply moved Emily, inspiring her to think about ways to help not just Lily but other young women in similar situations. Thomas noticed the impact this experience was having on Emily and decided to give her even more responsibility. He suggested that she develop a small pilot project aimed at helping young people like Lily, something that combined shelter, counseling, and educational opportunities. "I believe in you, Emily," he said. "You have the heart and determination needed to lead this." That night, as Emily worked on the first drafts of the project at her small desk at home, a new kind of hope began to bloom within her. It wasn't just about changing her life or her family's anymore. It was about changing the lives of others as well. With the pilot project underway, Emily threw herself wholeheartedly into the work, dividing her time between classes, meetings with the foundation team, and visits to the shelter where she had met Lily. Slowly, her initial sketches began to take shape. A community center that would provide temporary housing, psychological support, and professional training workshops for vulnerable young people. Thomas, always present to guide her, was impressed by Emily's passion and dedication. "You're not just creating a project, Emily. You're building something that can transform lives forever," he said during one of their meetings. The confidence that Thomas and Claire placed in her continued to propel Emily forward, but the process was exhausting. She spent countless sleepless nights refining every detail, from the budget to the logistics of the workshops. Lily also became a constant presence in her life. They often talked about the struggles of living on the streets, and these conversations helped Emily refine her ideas for the project. One night, as Emily and Lily sat on a bench at the shelter, Lily asked, "Why are you doing all this? It's not your responsibility to take care of people like me." Emily looked at her, a gentle smile on her lips. "When I was your age, I felt like no one was listening, like no one cared, but someone gave me a chance. Now it's my turn to do the same." Those words left a deep impression on Lily, and she began to actively participate in the project, helping Emily identify the most pressing needs of the youth at the shelter. The project's launch was marked by a simple but moving event held at the space that would become the future community center. Nervous but determined, Emily stepped onto the stage to speak before a small audience of foundation members, local partners, and some of the young people who would benefit from the initiative. "This center isn't just a place to sleep or learn something new," Emily said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's a second chance. It's an opportunity to believe that the future can be different, no matter what the past has been." The room erupted in applause, and Emily realized her efforts were beginning to bear fruit. Lily was in the audience, smiling for the first time in a long while. Thomas and Claire exchanged proud glances, while Margaret and Tommy, also present at the event, looked at Emily with admiration. That night, as Emily returned to the apartment, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. The changes in her life were visible not just in her home or at the community center but also within herself. For the first time, Emily wasn't just someone struggling to survive. She was a catalyst for change, living proof that a single act of kindness could spark unimaginable transformation. The community center, now named Renovo, began to come to life. Emily devoted every spare moment to the center, working alongside volunteers and professionals who shared the same mission. With financial and strategic support from Thomas's foundation, resources flowed steadily, but it was Emily's heart that truly drove the project forward. Lily, who had initially been just an observer, became an integral part of the team. She helped welcome new youth to the center, sharing her story as a way to inspire them. "I know what it feels like to think no one cares, but here you'll see that you're not alone," she would tell newcomers, with a confidence that Emily had helped her cultivate. Despite the progress, the challenges didn't disappear. Many of the youth who arrived at Renovo carried deep emotional scars, and it wasn't uncommon for some to give up and return to the streets. Emily felt each loss as a personal blow, but Claire was always there to help her stay grounded. "You can't save everyone, Emily," Claire told her during a particularly difficult conversation, "but you can offer a choice to those who are ready. That, in itself, is a miracle." Those words helped Emily move forward, especially during moments of doubt. She knew that every small victory mattered, and she focused on the successes to avoid being overwhelmed by the setbacks. One of those victories came when a young man named Jake, who had been part of Renovo, got his first job after completing a skills training course offered by the center. During a small celebration over the weekend, he approached Emily and handed her a handwritten thank you letter. "I don't know where I'd be without this," Jake said, his eyes shining with emotion. "You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Emily read the letter later that night, alone in her room, and Jake's words brought tears to her eyes. Every effort, every sleepless night, it all felt worth it in that moment. As Renovo grew, Emily also began to see the impact that the transformation in her life was having on her family. Margaret, now healthier and stronger, spent her days sewing and contributing to the household income with small projects, while Tommy thrived at his new school, participating in activities that had once been out of reach. One night, during dinner together, Tommy looked at Emily and said, "I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to help people too." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "You're already helping, Tommy, just by being you." That moment stayed with her. It wasn't just the success of Renovo or the impact on others that drove her. It was seeing her own family finally flourishing, something that had once felt impossible. A few years later, Emily, now 22 years old, stood in a special ceremony at Detroit's main auditorium. The event celebrated the impact of Renovo, which had grown far beyond its initial vision. Over 500 young people had been helped, and many of them were present, each with a story of resilience and transformation that reflected the power of the project. As Emily waited for her turn to speak, she scanned the crowd. She recognized familiar faces. Lily, now one of the center's leaders, radiant in a simple but elegant blue dress. Jake, who had been promoted at his job and was now a mentor in the program. And, of course, her family. Margaret, her eyes glistening with pride, sat in the front row beside Tommy, now 13 years old and excitedly telling everyone about his ambitions to follow in Emily's footsteps. When her name was called, Emily walked onto the stage. Her heart was racing, but as she looked out at the audience, a wave of calm washed over her. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "A few years ago, I was lost. Life felt like a constant struggle, and I often wondered if things would ever change. Then, one act of kindness changed everything." The room fell silent, each of her words seeming to reach the hearts of everyone present. I didn't know, on that cold night, that giving my jacket to a man who seemed to need it more than I did was the start of a new journey. What I've learned since then is that every act of generosity, no matter how small it seems, can spark an impact far greater than we imagine. Emily paused, her gaze finding Thomas Bennett in the audience. He smiled at her, proud. I wouldn't be here without the people who believed in me, who gave me a chance when I couldn't see beyond my struggles. That's why Renovo exists, because each of us has the power to do something extraordinary, even when it feels small. Applause filled the room, and Emily smiled, overwhelmed with emotion. As she stepped off the stage, Lily hugged her tightly. You changed my life, Emily, and now we're changing other lives together. After the event, Thomas approached Emily with a thoughtful expression. You've done something extraordinary here, he said, but I feel like your journey is just beginning. He then revealed a new plan, to expand Renovo's model to other cities, bringing its impact to more underserved communities. Are you ready for this? He asked. Emily smiled, her determination renewed. Yes, I'm ready. That night marked a new chapter in Emily's life, not just as a young woman who had overcome adversity, but as a leader committed to spreading the same hope that had once been given to her. As she walked home with her family, snow began to fall softly, blanketing the city in white. Emily looked up at the sky, feeling the cold on her face, but now there was something different. Instead of fighting against it, she embraced it, knowing that there would always be warmth in the hearts she touched. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and a comment. Let me know which city you're watching this video from. A big hug, and see you in the next story.